He left her under crystal chandeliers, smiling beside a model like Emily had already faded from the room, like she had never mattered, and everyone watched her walk out alone, erased, humiliated, replaced. Months later, the same man stood frozen as the ballroom doors opened, and she stepped in wearing emerald silk, no longer the woman he discarded, but someone untouchable. Her hand resting calmly in that of Alexander Hayes, a billionaire whose name alone shifted the room. And when he introduced her, the silence wasn't shock. It was power, because Nathan finally realized he hadn't lost her. He had lost everything. He didn't just leave her. He erased her. The whisper moved through the glittering ballroom before the music even had time to recover. And under the golden spill of chandeliers, Emily Carter stood perfectly still, her fingers tightening ever so slightly around the stem of a champagne glass she hadn't touched, as if the weight of the moment had settled into something physical, something she could feel pressing against her ribs. Because across the room, Nathan Carter, her husband, or what was left of that word, was smiling in a way she hadn't seen in years. Easy, bright, effortless, his hand resting at the small of Lily Vance's back like it had always belonged there, like Emily had only ever been a placeholder, a draft he had outgrown, and the crowd, their crowd, the people who once filled their weekends and their dining table, watched with that quiet, practiced curiosity of people who sensed a shift in power and were already choosing sides. And then Nathan spoke, his voice cutting clean. Through the hum of conversation, smooth and controlled, the same voice that used to promise her forever, now reshaped into something colder, something public. Emily and I have decided to go our separate ways, he said, though they both knew she hadn't decided anything. Some people just don't grow into the life they're given. And there it was, not loud, not cruel in tone, but devastating in precision. A sentence designed to reduce her, to turn years of loyalty, of quiet sacrifices, of nights spent waiting and believing into something small enough to dismiss in a single breath. And Emily felt it all at once. The heat rising in her chest, the memory of every time she had made herself less so he could feel like more, the echo of his voice, telling her she was lucky, that she should be grateful, that this life, this glittering, suffocating life, was something she could never have built on her own. And for a moment, just a flicker of a moment, the room tilted, the lights too bright, the laughter too sharp, the scent of expensive perfume clinging to the air like something she could no longer breathe. But she didn't break, she didn't cry, because somewhere beneath the humiliation, beneath the quiet collapse of everything she thought, she had something else stirred, something steadier, something that refused to disappear. And so she set the untouched glass down on the nearest tray, her movements calm, almost detached, as if she were stepping out a scene that no longer belonged to her. And when she turned, when she walked past the people who avoided her eyes or offered those thin, sympathetic smiles, she didn't rush, she didn't look back, not even when she felt Nathan's gaze flicker toward her for a fraction of a second. Because this time, for the first time in years, she understood something he didn't, something no one in that room could see yet. That leaving wasn't losing, that being erased from his world might be the only way to finally exist in her own. And as the heavy doors closed behind her, sealing off the noise, the light, the version of herself she had spent years trying to hold together, Emily Carter stepped into the cool night air with nothing left to her name but the quiet, unshakable certainty that she was not the woman he had just discarded, not anymore. The silence outside the ballroom felt louder than anything inside it, the kind of silence that pressed against her ears until her own breathing sounded unfamiliar. And Emily Carter stood on the sidewalk for a moment longer than necessary, the cool night air brushing against her bare arms, grounding her in a reality that felt both terrifying and strangely clear, because for the first time in years, there was no one to perform for, no expectation to meet, no version of herself she needed to maintain, only the quiet, unsettling truth that everything she had built her identity around was gone. And yet she was still standing, still breathing, still here, and that realization settled slowly, like something fragile that might grow if she did not rush it. So she walked, not toward anything specific, just away, heels clicking softly against the pavement, each step carrying her further from the life that had once defined her. In the days that followed, the unraveling was not dramatic, it was quiet, almost clinical, like a room being emptied piece by piece. She left the penthouse with only what was hers, which was less than she had expected, fewer clothes, fewer memories, fewer things that truly belonged to her, and the rest, the marble. Surfaces, the tailored furniture, the curated art, all of it had always belonged to Nathan, to his world, to the image he had built and she had simply occupied. And now, in a small apartment across town with creaky floors and a window that overlooked a narrow street instead of skyline, Emily began to understand the difference between having a life and having a role in someone else's, because this place was not impressive. It was not something anyone would envy, but it was hers, every inch of it, every quiet corner, every imperfect detail, and the absence of noise, of expectation, of constant comparison, created a space she had not realized she needed. And yet the nights were the hardest, when the stillness stretched too long and memories slipped in uninvited, flashes of laughter that no longer meant anything, conversations that now felt rehearsed, the subtle ways Nathan had reshaped her over time, not with force, but with suggestion, with quiet corrections, with the steady implication that she was almost enough but never quite, and she had believed him. That was the part that lingered, the part that made her chest tighten when she stood in front of the mirror and did not immediately recognize the woman looking back. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to shift, not in grand gestures, not in dramatic reinvention, but in small decisions. She started taking freelance design work again, something she had set aside years ago because it did not fit into Nathan's version of success. She spent hours at a small desk by the window, sketching, planning, rebuilding a skill she had once loved and nearly forgotten. And each completed project, no matter how small, added a quiet layer of confidence, something steady and internal that did not depend on anyone else's approval. And one afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the thin curtains and painted soft patterns across her workspace, her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number, a message brief and direct from someone named Alexander Hayes, referencing a project she had done for a previous client, asking if she would consider consulting on something larger, something more complex. And Emily stared at the screen longer than she expected, her reflection faintly visible against the dark glass. And for a moment, the old instinct surfaced, the hesitation, the doubt, the voice that questioned whether she was ready, whether she was enough. But then she exhaled slowly, steadying herself, and typed a simple reply, yes, because this time she was not waiting to be chosen. She was choosing to step forward, even if she did not yet know exactly where it would lead. Opportunity, she would learn, did not arrive with noise. It arrived quietly, like everything that mattered. And when Emily Carter walked into the office building on Madison Avenue for the first time, there was no red carpet, no audience, no one waiting to see if she would fail or succeed, just a glass door, a receptionist who barely looked up, and the steady rhythm of a world that did not yet know her name. And that was exactly why it felt different, because nothing about this moment depended on who she used to be, only on what she could do now. And as she rode the elevator up, watching the city shrink into reflections of steel and sunlight, she noticed something unfamiliar in her chest. Not fear, not quite confidence, but something steadier, something earned. And when the doors opened, Alexander Hayes was already there, standing near the window with his back partially turned, his presence understated but unmistakable, not because he demanded attention, but because he did not need to. And when he turned to face her, his expression was calm, assessing, not dismissive, not impressed, simply aware, as if he saw exactly what she was and was waiting to see what she would choose to become. And he greeted her without ceremony, without reference to anything she had been, only to the work itself, the project laid out across the table, complex, detailed, demanding a level of precision she had not been asked to deliver in years. And yet, as she leaned in, studying the plans, asking questions, offering observations, something aligned inside her, something that had been dormant but not gone. And for the first time since she walked out of that ballroom, she was not thinking about Nathan, not thinking about Lily, not thinking about what had been taken from her. She was thinking about structure, about design, about how to build something that lasted. And Alexander listened, really listened, his attention steady, his responses measured. And when she finished, there was no immediate praise, no exaggerated reaction, just a small, almost imperceptible nod, the kind that carried more weight than any compliment, because it was not given lightly. And as the meeting ended, he said something simple, something that stayed with her long after she left. You see, what most people overlook, and it was not framed as encouragement, it was a statement of fact. And in the weeks that followed, the work grew, one project becoming two, then three, each one more complex, more visible. Her name beginning to move quietly through conversations she was not part of. Recommendations passed from one client to another, not because of who she knew, but because of what she delivered. And slowly, almost without noticing, her world expanded, not in spectacle, but in substance, her small apartment filling with sketches, plans, contracts, each one a piece of something she was building for herself. And the mirror she once avoided became something she faced without hesitation, not because she had transformed overnight, but because she no longer needed to measure herself against someone else's expectations. In one evening, as she stood by her window, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond her, her phone lit up again, a message from Alexander, brief as always, informing her of an upcoming event, a gala, the kind of space she once moved through as someone else's reflection. But this time the invitation was different, not as an accessory, not as a name attached to someone else's success, but as a principal consultant on the very project that would be unveiled that night. And as she read the message, her reflection in the glass no longer looked uncertain, no longer looked like someone who had been left behind, but like someone standing at the edge of something larger, something entirely her own. And for the first time, the thought of walking back into that world did not feel like returning, it felt like arriving. The invitation did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived in a simple envelope. Thick paper, understated, the kind that did not need to prove its importance. And Emily Carter held in her hands for a moment longer than necessary, her fingers tracing the edge as if she could feel the weight of what it represented. Because this was not just another event, not just another room filled with polished smiles and quiet judgments. This was a threshold, and she knew it. Even before she opened it, even before she read the details that confirmed what she already felt, the unveiling of a major development project, her project, the one she had spent months shaping, refining, rebuilding from a concept into something real, something tangible. And as the evening approached, the city seemed to hum with a familiar energy, the same kind that used to make her feel small, like she was always slightly out of place. But this time, the feeling was different, quieter, steadier. And as she stood in front of her closet, her hand resting on a garment bag she had not touched in years, she paused, not out of uncertainty, but out of awareness, because the choice she made now was not about impressing anyone. It was about representing herself. And when she unzipped the bag, revealing a deep emerald gown that caught the light even in the dimness of her apartment, she felt something shift, not a transformation, but a recognition, as if she was finally meeting the version of herself she had been becoming all along. And when she arrived at the venue, the building rose above the street, in glass and steel, its entrance framed by soft golden light, the kind that turned every arrival into a quiet spectacle. And for a brief moment, as the car door opened and the sounds of the evening spilled toward her, she remembered the last time she had stood at a threshold like this, the way her heart had raced, the way she had braced herself for what might happen inside. But this time, she did not hesitate. She stepped forward, her posture relaxed, her gaze steady, and the room, already alive with conversation and movement, seemed to pause just slightly as she entered, not because they recognized her, not yet, but because presence like hers did not go unnoticed. And across the room, conversation shifted, glances lingered, and somewhere near the center, Nathan Carter stood with Lily Vance. At his side, their reflection caught in the polished surfaces that surrounded them, still playing the roles they had perfected, still unaware of how much had changed, and Emily saw them. Of course she did, but the recognition did not strike like it once would have. It did not tighten her chest or pull her backward. It simply existed, like a memory that no longer held power. And as she moved further into the room, greeting clients, exchanging quiet words with those who knew her work, she felt the difference in how people responded, not with curiosity, not with polite obligation, but with respect, something that settled around her like a second skin, natural, unforced, and when Alexander Hayes approached, his presence as calm and composed as ever. There was no grand gesture, no announcement, just a shared understanding reflected in the brief meeting of their eyes. And as he offered his arm, not as a display, but as a partnership, something subtle and deliberate, Emily accepted. And together they moved toward the center of the room, toward the moment that would reveal more than anyone there was prepared to see. And somewhere behind them, Nathan turned, his attention caught by something he could not yet name, a shift in the room, a change in the air. And for the first time that night, the certainty he wore so easily began to falter, just slightly, as if something he thought he understood was about to prove him wrong. The room did not fall silent all at once. It shifted, like a current changing direction beneath the surface, subtle at first, then undeniable, as Alexander Hayes stepped forward, his voice carrying just enough to gather attention without demanding it. And beside him, Emily Carter stood with a calm that did not need to be performed, her posture effortless, her gaze steady, as if she had always belonged exactly where she was. And Nathan Carter felt it before he understood it, the way conversations near him slowed, the way people began to turn not toward him, but past him, toward something greater, something he had not accounted for. And when Alexander began to speak about the project, about vision, about precision and execution, the language was familiar, the kind of language Nathan had built his reputation on. And yet there was a difference, a clarity, a depth that made it impossible to dismiss. And then, without flourish, without spectacle, Alexander gestured slightly toward Emily, not as an accessory, not as an afterthought, but as the center of something significant. This project exists because of her, he said, his tone even certain, leaving no space for doubt, and the words settled into the room with a weight that shifted everything, because recognition like that, in a room like this, was not given lightly. And for a moment, no one moved, as if they were recalibrating, adjusting to a narrative they had not expected. And Nathan's expression held, but only just the edges of his confidence tightening as he looked at her, really looked at her, not as the woman he had dismissed, but as the one being acknowledged in a way he understood too well. And Lily's hand, still resting lightly on his arm, felt suddenly misplaced, as if she could sense the shift without fully grasping it. And Emily did not look at them. Not yet, because this moment was not about confrontation. It was about presence, about standing in a space she had earned without needing to reclaim anything from the past. And as the presentation continued, visuals unfolding across the room, designs brought to life, conversations began again, but differently now, directed toward her, questions asked with genuine interest, with respect, and she answered with the same quiet precision she had built over months of work, never raising her voice, never seeking validation, simply existing, within the certainty of what she had created. And it was in that quiet authority that the real shift became undeniable, because power did not announce itself. It revealed itself through recognition. And when Nathan finally stepped forward, drawn by something he could not ignore, his voice measured, almost careful. "Emily," he said, as if testing the name in a context he no longer controlled. And she turned then, meeting his gaze without hesitation, without emotion, just a calm acknowledgement. And in that brief exchange, everything that had once defined them dissolved, not in anger, not in bitterness, but in irrelevance, because the woman standing before him was not the one he had left behind, and he knew it, even if he could not yet understand how it had happened. And as the room continued to move around them, as the evening unfolded with its quiet elegance and shifting alliances, Nathan Carter realized something that No one needed to say out loud, something that settled deep and unshakable, that the version of Emily he had believed he could replace had never truly been who she was. And now, faced with who she had become, he was no longer part of her story at all. The moment passed, but its echo did not. It lingered in the air long after Nathan Carter spoke her name, long after Emily turned away from him with nothing more than a quiet acknowledgement, because the real impact was not in what was said, it was in what no longer needed to be said. And as the evening continued, the room reorganized itself around a new center of gravity, conversations bending toward her, opportunities unfolding with a subtle inevitability, as if the world had simply been waiting for her to step into place. And Emily moved through it with a calm that felt almost effortless, not because she was untouched by the past, but because she was no longer defined by it. And across the room, Nathan watched, not openly, not in a way that would draw attention, but in fragments, in stolen glances that he could not seem to control, trying to reconcile the woman he had dismissed with the one standing before him now. And each time he looked, the distance between those two versions of her seemed to widen, not because she had become someone else, but because he had never truly seen who she was to begin with. And beside him, Lily shifted, her confidence no longer as sharp. Her smile held a fraction too long, as if she could feel the shift in attention, the subtle withdrawal of the room from their orbit, and it unsettled her in a way she could not quite name, because the rules she understood, the ones built on appearance and proximity to power, were no longer holding. And for the first time, Nathan felt something unfamiliar, not loss exactly, but the awareness of having miscalculated something fundamental, and that awareness followed him as the night unfolded, as deals were discussed without him, as introductions were made that did not include him, as the center he once occupied quietly moved beyond his reach, and Emily, at the heart of it, remained unchanged in her composure, answering questions, listening carefully, her presence steady and unforced. And when Alexander stood beside her, there was no display, no need to define what existed between them, because it was evident in the way they operated, aligned, equal, each reinforcing the other without overshadowing. And it was in that quiet partnership that the final realization began to settle, not just for Nathan, but for anyone who had once believed they understood the hierarchy of that room. Because Emily was not there as someone who had been elevated, she was there as someone who had risen. And there was a difference that could not be ignored. And as the evening began to draw toward its close, as the lights softened and the conversations thinned, Nathan found himself standing still, the noise of the room fading into something distant, his gaze fixed on a moment he could not undo, not the one where she walked away, but the one where he decided she was not enough, because now, faced with the quiet certainty of who she had become, that judgment felt less like truth and more like a failure of his own perception. And across the room, Emily stepped toward the exit, not hurried, not lingering, simply moving forward. And for a brief second, she paused near the doorway, not to look back at him, but to take in the space one last time, the same kind of room that had once made her feel invisible, now holding her presence in a way that could not be overlooked. And then she walked out, the doors closing softly behind her, leaving the rest of them inside to sit with the realization that the woman they thought had been replaced had never needed to compete, because she had already moved beyond the game entirely. The city felt different after that night, not louder, not brighter, but clearer, as if something invisible had finally settled into place. And Emily Carter noticed it in the smallest details, in the way people greeted her without hesitation, in the way her name carried weight in rooms she had not yet entered, in the quiet certainty that followed her from one meeting to the next. And yet, for all the external changes, the most significant shift remained internal, steady and unshaken, because she no longer measured her worth against anyone else's perception, not Nathan's, not the crowd's, not even the expectations that once lived quietly in the back of her mind. And as the weeks unfolded, her work expanded in ways that felt both natural and deliberate, projects evolving into larger ventures, introductions turning into partnerships, her schedule filling with conversations that mattered, decisions that shaped outcomes. And through it all, Alexander Hayes remained a constant presence. Not overwhelming, not intrusive, but aligned, his trust in her ability never needing to be spoken aloud. And it was in that unspoken understanding that something stronger than validation took root, something built on respect rather than approval. And one afternoon, as they reviewed a new proposal overlooking the city from his office, sunlight stretching across the glass walls in long, golden lines, Alexander paused, his attention shifting from the documents to her, not with curiosity, but with a kind of recognition that carried weight. "You have a way of seeing the end before anyone else understands the beginning," he said, his tone calm, certain, and Emily did not respond. Immediately, not because she did not have an answer, but because she was still learning to accept statements like that without questioning them, without deflecting, without diminishing their truth, and instead, she allowed the words to settle, to exist without resistance. And in that quiet acceptance, something within her strengthened, not dramatically, not visibly, but undeniably, and later that evening, as she returned to her apartment, the familiar space now layered with sketches, contracts, and the quiet evidence of everything she had built. Her phone buzzed with a notification she did not expect, a message from a number she recognized immediately. One she had not seen since the night, everything changed, and for a moment, she simply looked at the screen, the name alone enough to stir a distant echo of what used to be, but not enough to disrupt what now existed. And when she opened the message, it was brief, carefully worded, almost restrained, asking if they could talk, if there was a moment to meet. And Emily read it once, then again, not searching for meaning, not analyzing tone, simply observing it as it was a request from someone who no longer held any authority in her life. And for a brief second, the past hovered at the edge of her thoughts, not as pain, not as regret, but as something resolved, something complete, and she set the phone down without replying, not out of avoidance, not out of anger, but because she understood something. Now that she had not before, that closure was not something he could offer her. It was something she had already given herself. And as the city lights flickered on outside her window, stretching endlessly into the distance, Emily Carter stood in the quiet of her own space, not wondering what he wanted, not questioning what might have been, but fully aware of what she had become. And for the first time, the idea of hearing his voice again did not feel like a step forward or backward. It simply felt unnecessary, because the life she was building no longer required anything from the one she had left behind. Some messages do not demand a response. They reveal a choice. And Emily Carter understood that as she stood in the quiet of her apartment, the glow of the city stretching endlessly beyond the glass, her phone resting untouched on the table where Nathan's name still lingered on the screen, no longer urgent, no longer powerful, just a name, and yet the past had a way of testing the strength of what came after it, not through force, but through invitation, and for a brief moment she allowed herself to consider it. Not the man he had been, not the version of him that once defined her world, but the simple fact that he was reaching out now, after everything had shifted, after everything he had dismissed had become something undeniable. And there was a quiet clarity in recognizing that timing, in understanding that his request was not about her. It was about what he now saw, what he now realized he had lost. And that realization did not stir anger. It did not reopen anything she had already closed. It simply confirmed what she had come to understand, that some doors, once walked through, were not meant to be reopened. And the following morning, the city moved as it always did, steady, indifferent, the rhythm of it grounding her in something real, something forward-moving. And as she stepped into another day, filled with meetings, decisions, and the quiet expansion of everything she had built, the message from the night before faded into the background, not forgotten, but placed exactly where it belonged, in the past. And later that afternoon, as she sat across from Alexander Hayes in a private conference room, the skyline stretching wide behind him, the conversation shifted from projects to something more personal, though it was never framed that way. never softened into sentiment, because that was not how either of them operated. Yuka did not respond. He said, not as a question, but as an observation, and Emily met his gaze without hesitation. There was nothing to say. She replied, her tone even, not defensive, not dismissive, simply certain, and he nodded once. A small acknowledgement that carried more weight than agreement, because it reflected understanding. And in that moment, there was no need to explain further, no need to justify the silence she had chosen, because it was not avoidance, it was resolution. And as the conversation returned to work, to strategy, to the next phase of what they were building, the future unfolded in front of her not as something uncertain, but as something she was actively shaping. And yet, as the evening approached, another message appeared, shorter this time, more direct, asking again, not for closure, not for reconciliation, but simply for a moment, a conversation. And Emily looked at it, her reflection faintly visible in the darkened screen, and this time she did not set it aside immediately, not because it held power, but because she recognized something else, something quieter, that facing the past did not mean returning to it, and that a conversation, when approached without expectation, without emotional weight, could exist without undoing what she had built. And so, after a pause that felt measured, intentional, she typed a brief reply, not warm, not cold, simply clear, agreeing to meet, not out of curiosity, not out of obligation, but out of a quiet confidence that she was no longer the woman who would be affected by whatever he had to say. And as she set the phone down, the city lights reflecting softly across the room, Emily Carter understood something with absolute certainty, that this meeting, if it happened, would not be about revisiting the past. It would be about confirming just how far beyond it she had already gone. The meeting was set for late afternoon, the kind of hour when the city softened just slightly, when the sharp edges of the day gave way to something quieter, more reflective, and Emily Carter arrived exactly on time. Not early, not late, her steps measured as she entered the small, understated cafe tucked between glass towers, a place chosen, not for status, but for privacy. And as she stepped inside, the familiar scent of coffee and warm light wrapped around her, grounding her in a moment that felt both ordinary and significant, and she saw him almost immediately. Nathan Carter seated near the window, his posture composed, his expression carefully neutral, as if he had rehearsed this version of himself, the one that did not reveal too much, the one that still believed control could be maintained through presentation. And for a brief second, she observed him the way one might observe a memory, something recognizable, but distant, no longer tied to anything real. And when she approached, he stood, a small gesture of respect that felt unfamiliar coming from him. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, not out of tension, but because there was nothing immediate to fill the space, no shared rhythm to fall back into. And finally, he broke the silence, his voice quieter than she remembered, stripped of the easy confidence that once defined it. "You look different," he said, the words simple, but weighted with something he could not quite articulate. And Emily met his gaze calmly, not deflecting, not engaging beyond what was necessary. "I am," she replied, her tone even, leaving no room for interpretation, and they sat, the distance between them small in space, but immeasurable in everything else. And Nathan spoke again, this time more directly, explaining without fully explaining, circling around the idea of regret without naming it, referencing decisions, timing, things that could have been handled differently, as if reframing the past might somehow reshape its outcome. And Emily listened, not interrupting, not reacting, simply allowing the words to exist without absorbing them, because she recognized something now that she had not before, that explanations offered after the fact were not about truth, they were about comfort, about easing the weight of choices already made. And when he paused, when the carefully constructed narrative reached its natural end, he looked at her with something closer to honesty, something less practiced. "I did not realize," he said slowly, "what I was walking away from." And the sentence lingered between them, not as an apology, not as a request, but as a realization that had come too late, and Emily considered it for a moment, not searching for a response, but acknowledging the shift it represented. And when she spoke, her voice was steady, unhurried. "You did," she said, not with accusation, not with anger, but with clarity. "You just did not value it." And there was no harshness in the words, only truth. And that truth settled into the space between them with a quiet finality, because it removed the illusion that anything had been misunderstood, that anything had been accidental. And Nathan exhaled slowly, as if the weight of that realization had finally found its place, and for the first time. Since she had known him, he did not try to reshape it, did not argue, did not deflect. And in that moment, something closed, not abruptly, not dramatically, but completely. And as Emily stood, her movements calm, deliberate, she did not offer a second chance, did not suggest staying in touch, did not extend the conversation beyond what it had already been, because there was nothing left to resolve, nothing left to reclaim. And as she stepped away from the table, leaving him in the quiet aftermath of his own understanding, she felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a steady sense of completion. And as she walked back into the rhythm of the city, the past no longer followed her, not even as an echo, because she had not just moved on from it, she had outgrown it entirely. Closure did not arrive as a dramatic turning point. It arrived quietly, in the absence of weight. And as Emily Carter stepped out of the cafe and back into the rhythm of the city, she realized there was nothing left behind her that could follow, nothing unresolved, nothing unfinished. Only a chapter that had already ended long before this final conversation. And in the days that followed, that clarity settled into her life with a calm permanence, not as relief, but as space to move forward without hesitation, without the subtle pull of what used to be. And her world continued to expand, not rapidly, not chaotically, but with a steady precision that reflected the way she approached everything now, thoughtfully, intentionally. And as new projects unfolded, as meetings filled her calendar and her work began to take shape on a larger scale, she noticed something that once would have felt impossible, that she no longer questioned whether she belonged in these spaces. She simply existed within them, fully, without adjustment, without performance. And one evening, as she stood in a newly completed building, the city stretching out below in a pattern of light and motion, she watched as people moved through a space she had designed, interacting with something that had once existed only in her mind. And there was a quiet satisfaction in that, not the kind that demanded recognition, but the kind that confirmed she was exactly where she was meant to be. And beside her, Alexander Hayes observed the same scene, his presence as steady as ever, his attention not on the structure itself, but on her, as if measuring something beyond the visible. And after a moment, he spoke, his voice low, deliberate. "You built something that will outlast the moment it was created for," he said. And Emily turned slightly, considering the words, not with surprise, but with understanding, because she knew what he meant, not just about the building, but about everything she had reconstructed from what had once been broken. And for a brief moment, there was silence between them, not empty, but full, a pause that carried more meaning than any extended conversation. And then, without ceremony, without the need to define it, he extended something simple, a future project, a larger scale, a partnership that would place her not just within the work, but at the center of it. And Emily accepted, not with hesitation, not with disbelief, but with the same quiet certainty that had carried her through every step of her transformation. And as they stood there, overlooking a city that no longer felt overwhelming, no longer felt like something she had to navigate carefully, she understood that this was not a return, not a redemption in the way others might define it. It was something more complete, something that did not depend on comparison or validation. And somewhere in that realization, the past fully released its hold, not because it had been confronted, not because it had been resolved in words, but because it no longer held any relevance to the life she was living now. And as the lights of the city continued to flicker below, steady and endless, Emily Carter stood in a space she had created beside a future she had chosen. and for the first time, there was nothing left to prove, only everything left to build. Power does not announce itself. It reveals itself in who listens, when you speak, and who waits when you move. And Emily Carter began to notice that difference more clearly with each passing day, not as something she chased, but as something that followed her naturally. And as the project she led expanded beyond single buildings into entire developments, entire districts shaped by her vision, the conversations around her shifted from participation to leadership, from contribution to direction. And in those rooms, filled with investors, architects, executives, people who once would have seen her as peripheral, her voice carried with a quiet authority that did not need reinforcement, because it was grounded in results, in consistency, in a clarity that others had learned to trust. And yet, what set her apart was not just what she built, but how she moved within it, without arrogance, without the need to dominate, allowing space for others while never losing control of the outcome. And it was in that balance that her influence grew, steady and undeniable. And one morning, as she reviewed a proposal for a project that would redefine an entire section of the city, Alexander Hayes stood across from her, his attention focused not on the documents, but on her decisions, the way she navigated complexity with precision, the way she anticipated outcomes before they fully formed. And when she finished outlining her approach, he did not respond immediately, allowing a brief silence to settle, the kind that signaled something more than routine. Agreement. You are not building within the system anymore, he said finally, his voice measured. You are shaping it. And the words did not feel like praise, they felt like recognition, a reflection of something she had already begun to understand but had not yet defined. And Emily absorbed them without hesitation, without doubt, because they aligned with what she was experiencing, not just in her work, but in herself. A shift from adapting to environments to defining them, from fitting into expectations to setting them. And as the meeting concluded, the next phase of their partnership became clear, not as a step forward, but as an elevation, placing her at the center of decisions that would extend far beyond individual projects, in an influence that shaped markets, communities, the way people lived within the spaces she envisioned. And as she stepped out into the city later that day, the scale of it no longer felt overwhelming. It felt navigable, intentional, as if she could trace its patterns and understand where she fit within them. Not as a participant, but as a creator, and in that realization, something settled fully into place, not excitement, not validation, but a quiet certainty that this was no longer a transition, no longer a process of becoming. It was a state of being, and as she moved through the crowd, unnoticed by most, recognized by some, she carried that certainty with her, not as something visible, but as something deeply rooted, and somewhere in a different part of the city, in rooms she no longer entered, her name was spoken with a different tone, not as a memory, not as a comparison, but as a benchmark, something to measure against. And that, more than anything, marked the final shift, because it meant that what she had built was no longer connected to where she had come from. It stood on its own, complete, undeniable, and entirely hers. Respect is not something that arrives all at once. It accumulates, layer by layer, decision by decision, until one day it becomes undeniable. And Emily Carter saw it clearly now, not in applause, not in grand gestures, but in the way rooms adjusted when she entered, in the way conversations paused just slightly, in the way people listened not out of politeness, but out of recognition. And as the scale of her work expanded beyond individual developments into something larger, something that influenced entire sectors, the lines between participation and authority faded completely, leaving her not as someone invited into the conversation, but as someone who defined it. And yet, what made the shift complete was not external. It was internal, the absence of doubt, the absence of hesitation, the quiet certainty that no longer questioned whether she belonged. Because belonging was no longer something granted by others. It was something she carried with her. And one evening, as she stood at the edge of another completed project, the skyline reflecting across glass surfaces she had helped design, the city stretching endlessly in every direction, she became aware of how far she had come, not in distance, but in identity, and beside her, Alexander Hayes remained as he always had, steady, observant, his presence a constant that never imposed itself. And after a long moment of silence, he spoke, his voice low, measured. "You do not. Look back," he said, not as a question, but as an observation, and Emily allowed a small pause before answering. Not because she needed time to consider, but because she understood the weight of what he was asking. "There is nothing there for me anymore," she replied, her tone calm, final, and the simplicity of the statement carried more meaning than any explanation could, because it was not denial, it was truth, and he nodded once, as if confirming something he had already known, and then, without ceremony, without unnecessary words, he extended something that had been building quietly between them for some time, not framed as an offer, not presented as an opportunity, but as a natural continuation of what already existed, a formal partnership, equal in title, equal in influence, placing her not beside him, but with him, and Emily accepted without hesitation, not because it elevated her, but because it reflected where she already stood, and, as the agreement settled into place, not with signatures, but with understanding, the final shift completed itself, not externally, not visibly, but internally, where it mattered most, because this was no longer about becoming something new, it was about fully inhabiting what she had already become. And as the city lights flickered on one by one, illuminating the work she had shaped, the spaces she had defined, Emily Carter stood at the center of a life that no longer resembled the one she had left behind, not in structure, not in meaning, and for the first time, there was no contrast to measure it against, no past to compare it to, only the present, complete and self-contained, and in that completeness, there was a quiet, unshakable peace that did not need to be proven, because it simply existed, steady, enduring, and entirely her own.